Hello, everyone here. Hello, everyone in the live stream. We're being broadcast. I'm delighted that you're all here with us today for the opening of the Young program at ELB International Literature Festival Berlin, which is celebrating a quarter of a century this year. 25 years for a festival for literature that is really impressive. Since 2000, every year there's been 20,000 visitors coming here to meet around 100 authors from all over the world. In the Young program, the spotlight is on authors of children's and young adult literature, and often they read from their very first book, so this is a stepping stone as well, this festival. Our guest today doesn't need a stepping stone. She's already jumped and is soaring. Candy Gourlay has been writing since the 1980s, first as a journalist for a weekly newspaper in the Philippines that refused to be intimidated by dictator Ferdinand Marcos. That newspaper helped to pave the way for the fall of the Marcos regime in 1986. The power of writing. I think this is a red thread that we are going to weave throughout this morning or midday. We'll have Candy Gourlay read from her current novel, Wild Song, and have a conversation about it in just a moment. But first, please join me in welcoming Candy Gourlay.
Hello. Thank you. Thank you. I'm going to say some German words, so please don't correct me if I'm wrong. Thank you to the Internationales Literaturfestival Berlin for inviting me to deliver this opening speech. Happy 25th birthday to the ILB. Happy 25 years of world literature in Berlin. I thank Lena Scheitz and the hardworking team of the Junges program. Thank you to Alexandra Rack, who translated my work to German. Thank you to my imprint, Rod Fuchs of Fischer Sauerlander. Vielen Dank. And in Filipino, maraming salamat po. I want to begin by telling you an interesting story. It's the story of how I met my husband. I'm just going to take my glasses off. But before I tell you the story of how I met my husband, I need to introduce you to the ordinary world. Do we have any writers in the audience? Well, if you are a writer, then you must learn about the ordinary world. In narrative structure, the ordinary world is when you introduce the world of the hero, not the world of the adventure, but the world that the hero leaves behind. So in Star Wars, before Luke Skywalker goes on his adventure, he lives on a desert planet called Tatooine. He had a boring job. Does anyone know what his boring job was? Can someone shout it? Jedi. No, he wasn't a Jedi. What was his boring job on Tatooine before he became a Jedi? No, he wasn't a mechanic. Okay, I'll have to tell you. No, come on. He was a moisture farmer, a moisture farmer. Does that sound interesting? No. And every day he would watch Tatooine's 2 moons rise above the desert. And he wondered, when will he be able to leave his boring job, fly spaceships, have adventures? Once you, the reader, connect with Luke Skywalker in his ordinary world, you will understand the stakes of his adventure to come. So my ordinary world was the Philippines. More than 7,000 plus islands just south of Hong Kong, surrounded by ocean. When I was just 3 years old, a man named Ferdinand Marcos became president of the Philippines. Marcos loved being president of the Philippines. Did you know that in many countries, the president of a country is also the commander-in-chief of all of its armies? Marcos loved that. It was power. Being president also meant that a lot of money poured into his pockets as people tried to buy his favor. And he loved money. He loved being president so much that he decided he wanted to be president forever. In 1972, Marcos declared martial law. Martial law meant ordinary law was suspended, and the country was ruled by the military. To be precise, the country was ruled by the military's commander-in-chief, Marcos. No more elections, no more democracy. He put his enemies in jail or had them shot. He had his friends take over the control of electricity, water, all the things that people depended upon. He became a dictator. By the way, I promise, this is still the story of how I met my husband. So this was my ordinary world. I was just 10 years old when martial law happened. When I finished secondary school at 16, Marcos was still president. I graduated from university, and Marcos was still president. When you're growing up in a dictatorship, everything is ordinary. You go to school, you play, you do your homework. You're a kid, so nobody tells you anything. My parents didn't tell me that several of my cousins had been killed because they opposed Marcos. They didn't tell me that people were disappearing. They didn't tell me that Marcos was emptying the treasury and the Philippines was on its way to becoming one of the poorest countries in the world. At the time, there was a magazine called Mr. and Ms., run by a woman named Eggy. She published stories about celebrities, beauty, and lifestyle. She didn't do politics. Then one day, Marcos's arch rival, a man named Ninoy, who had been in exile in the United States, decided to return to the Philippines to challenge Marcos. As soon as his plane landed, soldiers marched in and arrested him. But as he was being marched off the plane, Ninoy was shot dead. It was in headlines all over the world. But in the Philippines, the story was buried in the back pages of the newspapers. Eggy got so mad, she decided to photocopy all the headlines from abroad and publish them in a magazine she called the Special Edition. Filipinos, desperate for the truth, bought hundreds of thousands of copies, so she continued to publish it every Friday. I am telling you this because my first job was at Eggy's magazine. I was 22 years old, and I became a reporter at the most weirdly named anti-government political magazine in the world, Mr. and Ms. Special Edition. And I promise we'll get to the part where I met my husband very soon. But first, I'd like to share a tip with the writers and the audience. In every story, there are moments when the characters are called to make a decision. These are decisions that force a character to leave the ordinary world, leave everything that they know behind, when they decide, often reluctantly, to embrace the call to adventure. Once you've introduced your characters, once you've introduced your hero's world, it's time for your hero to decide. Will he go on the adventure or not? This narrative step is called crossing the threshold. The character makes a decision. He or she cannot change. So back to the Philippines. The dictatorship was getting worse and worse. Life in the Philippines was getting worse and worse. The killing of Ninoy led to several more assassinations of people who were against the government. The Philippines found itself at a threshold, a moment of decision. Should the people resist Or should we allow Marcos to stay in power? We decided to fight. And the Philippines had a revolution. While it's happening, it's hard to tell that you're in a revolution. It just feels like more of the same. Marcos called an election to prove to the world that Filipinos loved him and wanted him to stay being president. But he sent armed men into the schools where votes were being counted by school teachers. Literally, Marcos stole the boxes of votes and stuffed them with fake ballots in his favor. I was in a school not far from my office, watching teachers count ballots, when a group of men carrying guns came in. They pointed their guns at the teachers and began to grab the ballot boxes. I was really young, like you. I was so young, I was not afraid, because there were other journalists in the school. So I began to take photographs. The men turned their guns towards us, and they began throwing the ballot boxes and yelling, "Oh, there go my glasses." Okay. They began throwing the ballot boxes. One of the boxes caught my knee and tore my trousers, which were very expensive. But I kept my camera up. In the chaos, the men rushed out the door. And I, foolishly, rushed after them. It was only when the door closed behind me that I realized that nobody had followed me out. Uh-oh, I was alone with a bunch of angry men who had guns. And then suddenly, someone rushed out the door behind me. The men turned and hurried into a nearby building. The someone followed them and wedged his foot in the door as they tried to slam it shut. It was a skinny white man. He was trying to force the door open while they were trying to push it shut. "Look here," he shouted in an English accent. "Open the door." He was wearing an ID that identified him as a foreign journalist. Luckily for him, the bad men pushed and they pushed until the door slammed in his face. The man hurried over to me. "Marcos has a press conference on TV," he said. "Can you help me find a TV?" Remember, this was the 1980s, so there was no live streaming, there was no internet, and everything was on TV. Dear audience, at this point, I want to give you another writing tip. It's a relatively new concept that comes from romantic comedies in the movies. It's the moment when the hero meets a person who's going to become an important character in his adventure. It's called a meet cute. In Heartstopper, have you read Heartstopper? Or at least watched it on Netflix? In Heartstopper, Charlie Spring gives a heavy sigh when his teacher tells him to sit next to Nick Nelson, a rugby player in class. And then Nick Nelson looks up and their eyes meet. And well, in the Netflix series, animations of autumn leaves begin to swirl around his head and music, and that's a meet cute. So this white guy is standing in front of me. I notice that he has blondish brown hair. "My name is Richard Gourlay," he says. "Can you help me?" He had blue eyes. And of course, there was only one thing on my mind. Is he cute? But dear audience, looking at him, I didn't think he was cute. He had a rugby nose, one of those noses that look like this. It would take several meetings before I started to find him cute. I led Richard to a nearby canteen. I asked the lady behind the counter if he could watch their TV. And she put him in a plastic chair and gave him an ice-cold Coke, and he began to watch his boring press conference. I interviewed the lady and left Richard in the canteen for the office, where I filed a story about a stolen ballot box and a woman in a canteen hoping for change. This is how I tell the story of how I met my husband. I focus on tiny details, the way my trousers tore when the bad men threw things at me, the color of Richard's eyes, the ice-cold Coke as he watched TV. I tell it as a fun, exciting story, a romance. But if you were to ask Richard to tell you about how we met, He will start by giving you an overview of the political situation, the number of casualties recorded at every Philippine election, mathematics, arithmetic, the injustice, the inequality of the Marcos government. So boring. Sadly, Richard isn't really interested in being the main character in a romantic comedy, which was the way I told it. The story of how we met belongs to me, and it belongs to Richard. We tell the story in our own unique ways, and both versions deserve to be told, though Richard's version is definitely boring. Which brings me to another tip for you writers out there. When you're learning to write a novel, you need to understand all of these elements of story, the ordinary world, crossing the threshold, the meet cute, structure, character, setting, but that's not all. For a good story to be great, you need to inject something that will fill it with meaning, something that will make your story unique, something that differentiates it from all the other stories, even though it may be in some genre or follow the same genre or follow the same plot structure. Something that the author William Fiennes called the unmistakable I am. That very unique thing that makes you, you. It's not easy to find. Your unmistakable I am might reside in the most vulnerable part of you. Where did I find my unmistakable I am? It was everything that made me the person who I am now. My coming of age in the Philippines, my family's struggle against poverty in my youth, my experience of immigration to the UK, of alienation, and of difference in a society that didn't value me. Living away from my family in the Philippines means that while I live a vibrant and fulfilling life in England, I am always, always homesick for those I left behind. And somehow these complex, powerful feelings have made me a better writer. This is my unmistakable I am, and it underpins every single novel I have written. And so it was when writing one of my most difficult novels. It was almost 20 years ago when I discovered that in 1904, there was a World's Fair in St. Louis, Missouri. The most popular exhibit at that World Fair was the Philippine Reservation, with more than 1,000 Filipinos performing and exhibiting crafts. The World's Fair was a cultural landmark in the history of the United States. I thought it would make a fun middle grade story. I went to St. Louis and I trolled through the archives. Then I went to the Philippines to learn about the Igorots, who were going to be my main characters. And oh my God, I soon realized that for Filipinos, the World's Fair marked a time of death and defeat. In 1899, the United States invaded the Philippines, and a bloody war followed. The portable camera had been invented, and magazines and newspapers of the time featured photos of ditches filled with dead Filipinos. And the World's Fair? It was organized by ethnologists who believed in a pseudoscience called eugenics, the belief that white people were superior to people of color. The sources of my research, books, diaries, newspaper articles, were written by people who saw Igorots as savages and cannibals. It was a history interested only in justifying invasion and colonization. It was an era fully documented in photographs, but the voices of Filipinos were absent from the record. It was an unashamedly racist time, and reading the archives, I felt like I was constantly being belittled for my race. Instead of the fun middle grade story I was planning to write, I wrote the book I will present to you today, Wild Song. In writing Wild Song, I discovered dark layers of my culture that hark back to the World Fair, a time of utter degradation and racism. It was a time when the richness and diversity of culture in the Philippines was under attack and erasure. Many times, researching the book filled me with despair. In London, in a place called Walthamstow, there is a small community of Igorots. When we were about to launch Wild Song in London back in 2023, I sent their organization an invitation to my party. Imagine my surprise when they RSVP'd to say 100 people were coming. The venue only allowed 60 people, so they kindly agreed to send 30. Of the 30 who attended, 20 were children. I was astonished when they came dressed in their indigenous costumes, the boys wearing breechcloths, even though it was the dead of winter. And yet here were these Igorot children, proud to represent their indigenous selves as they danced and sang to honor my book. Despite all that difficult history, all the things that had happened to their ancestors, there they were at my book launch. Even though they were growing up in London, they knew who they were and where they came from. And seeing them filled all our hearts with light, which is great, because the theme of this literature festival is glow. Thank you for having me.
Thank you very much. Let's walk over. Thank you very much, Candy Gourlay.
You're welcome.
Now, you were just telling us that this book, that the idea came to you when you found out about the World Fair at St. Louis. And I figure this is probably, since you were talking to future writers, one of the hardest things to be aware of the moment when an idea occurs, because that is something that you have to receive, right? Rather than to manufacture. So I want to talk about this moment when you received that idea, and it has to do, I heard in a podcast, with a photograph from that World Fair. What was that, and how were you becoming aware of that there is something, a nucleus that you can expand upon?
I was trying to help write an introduction to another book about the Filipino diaspora. The Philippines has this strange thing where 11% of our population leave the country to work abroad. That's because it's a poor country and there's no money to be made in the Philippines. And so it's a huge diaspora, and most people will know someone who's left the country. So I was thinking, in the beginning of time, when did Filipinos start going abroad? And then I found this photograph of a man dancing with a white woman. And the strange thing about the photograph was you could see that the white woman came from the Victorian era, because she was wearing one of these dresses with a big skirt, and she wore a corset that made her body look like the body of a pigeon. They had this style, which was the pigeon silhouette, where your bust is bulging forward, your bum is bulging backwards, and it's very strange. And she was dancing with a half-naked man in a breechcloth, holding his hand. And I was like, oh my God, in that time, they were so modest that they wouldn't even hold hands with their husbands. What's she doing dancing with a half-naked boy? And when you looked at the boy, I immediately recognized he's an Igorot. I knew what Igorots looked like. I've seen them in the Philippines. And I was like, what was going on in this photograph? And it was the World's Fair.
And that's how you expanded on that. Let's get to know more about the ordinary world of the Igorots first. Please, would you?
Oh, yes. Am I reading?
Yeah. Okay. That's why we're here.
So I'm going to read from the first chapter of my book. And you have to remember that these people who live they had a very, very different culture. They believed that the dead didn't die. They lived amongst them. They're just invisible. And that plants and trees, they had souls. So this is the first chapter. The tree was singing. No, it's not, Samkad would have said. But he wasn't here yet, and anyway, what did he know about anything? I pressed my cheek against the bark to feel the tree's voice rumble in my blood, rough and low and shapeless, unlike American music with its bom, bom, bom. I like your song, I whispered to the tree. It calls my spirit.
Which was a good thing, Mother, because I'd been sitting on that branch for hours and I could barely keep my eyes open. The boar I'd been hunting for days was nowhere to be seen. My right leg had gone to sleep, and when I straightened it, my knee made a cracking noise, sudden and deafening as an American gunshot, which was unnerving in the moss-muffled silence of the forest. You've been dead a whole year, Mother. But I still glanced down nervously, half expecting to see you in the clearing below, fists planted in your waist, ordering me down from the tree like you'd done countless times before, bombarding me with questions. How had I acquired that breechcloth I was wearing? What had I done to my skirt? What if the Americans had caught me? Didn't they forbid hunting in the dark? The stillness was suddenly split by a violent screeching of monkeys in the next tree. What had set them off? I searched the gloom carefully, but there was nothing there. During the war, a lowland soldier had tried to hide in the mossy forest, but the Americans were not far behind, and he was soon captured. When the war was over, American patrols trawled through the forest, making a mess, hacking trees and shooting everything in sight. But now the patrols were gone, the forest was quiet again. The Americans had finished their warring and turned their attention to ruling us. So many new laws. Ancients must listen. Women must wear blouses. Children must go to American school. But no, Mother, as far as I was aware, hunting in the dark was still allowed. And nobody, not the Americans nor the ancients, needed to know whether I did so wearing a skirt or a breechcloth. Up the sun rose. The sky bloomed pink. The tops of the trees turned gold. A thick white mist boiled up on the forest floor. And the boar came. It was a great black lump gliding through the mist. Squealing softly, it began to root between the tree's toes, tail flicking its great meaty flanks. Mother, it was even bigger than the last one I caught. Crunch! The boar's head jerked up, ears pricked. Was that a human-shaped shadow, Mother? There, by the bush. The boar turned and stared. Then, from the opposite direction, running feet and barking. Little Luki! Samka, the idiot, burst into the clearing. His dog, Chuka, yapped from somewhere behind him. The boar spun to face Samkad. It lowered its head to attack. I leaped, landing between the boar and my friend so hard my teeth rattled in my skull. The boar launched itself, and I found myself on my back, its weight pinning me down, its head turning right and left, its tusks within gouging distance of my eyes, the hot, stinky breath washing over my face, its hairy hide coarse and wiry against my skin, the hooves scrabbling painfully at my waist. My spear was buried deep in its throat. The boar glared at me, its eyes sparking with anger and fear. I pushed the spear deeper. It grunted. The eyes began to glaze, and the hot, hairy body slumped against me. I wrenched myself from under it, backing away as the creature fell on its side. Its feet began to run as if it was racing from its own death. I watched the hooves kick and kick and kick, and then stop as its spirit drained from its body. The boar's soul was running in the invisible world of the dead now, and its flesh had become meat. I turned to check on Samkad, and Chuka the dog promptly stopped her yapping to throw herself in front of him, in case I tried to kiss him or something. Mother, I swear it's embarrassing to have a dog for a love rival. Samkad was fine, of course, gazing at me with wide-eyed admiration as Chuka danced about as if to say, me, 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 it's me you should look at. Do you need me to finish it off? Samkad said. But I hushed him. That rustling again. Who's there? I yelled, scooping up a rock and throwing it into the bushes. What is it? Shh. Just before I jumped down, I saw someone. If it was someone from the village, they would be rushing to report me to the ancients. Where? Over there. But there was nothing there. No footsteps, no trampled grass, no broken twigs. Had I imagined it? Maybe it was not someone, but a something, Samkad said. Yes, maybe it was just a monkey casting a large shadow. Mother, don't you dead people see everything? Was it a person? Shake a tree branch for yes, toss a pebble for no. Samkad turned to the boar. He'd already forgotten about it. Kneeling, he laid a hand on its head. Thank you, beast, he whispered. May you live contentedly in the invisible world. Then he got back to his feet and wrapped his arms around me. He smelled of damp soil and wet fern. His mouth pressed against my forehead was soft like fruit. It looks like I got here just in time, I snorted. Just in time? You were lucky it didn't gore you. It was not luck, it was you. You were magnificent, Samkad nuzzled my hair. That boar, it's twice the size of the other two. You did well. That's not what they're going to say. No, Sam said. There will be no thanks from all the hungry folk who are going to share this boar. Mother, it must amuse you to see us like this when just 5 years ago we were scrawny best friends with scabbed knees, brawling in the dirt when we weren't traipsing up and down the hills, pushing each other into rice paddies. But now we were both 16, and everything had changed. Later, when I had washed in a nearby stream and swapped my hunting breechcloth for a fresh skirt and blouse, Samkad tied the boar to a strong wooden pole. We each shouldered one end, Samkad in front, me at the back. The boar swung easily between us as we walked out of the forest and up the steep green slope towards the village. Samkad grinned over his shoulder. What shall we tell the ancients this time? All the excruciating details, I laughed. How you waited in the tree, how you leaped in front of the boar, how you speared the boar just so. Sam hooted with laughter. And when we got there, that was exactly what we told them. How Samkad had waited in the tree, how he leaped in front of the boar, how he speared the boar just so. And the ancients, gazing up at Sam's amiable smile, those honest brown eyes, those broad shoulders, that deep chest etched with tattoos that marked him out as a brave man, believed everything he said. Thank you.
Thank you. So that was the very beginning, the very introduction into Luki's ordinary world. Please tell us again, what kind of connection does Luki have to this ordinary world? What elements does it consist, and what hierarchies, and what is her stance to that?
The interesting thing about Luki's ordinary world is it's a village that has not been touched by outside forces. So that particular tribe that she belonged to was never colonized because the colonizers, we were colonized by Spain, America, and then later on Japan. I mean, we were like colonized by everybody. But they never got to the mountains where this village lived. And so they retained a lot of the original pre-colonial beliefs. And in her culture, although they valued women, they did value women. They had a special role in society. Men had a very structured role in society, men and women. Women had the babies, women tilled the soil, men protected the village, and men fought the wars, and the men were the ones who went hunting. Anything to do with a weapon, the men did. And I wondered, what would happen if you were a girl who wanted to do what the men did? And I wondered this because I was that little girl growing up. I grew up in a Catholic society. The Philippines is very conservative. And I wanted to do all the things that boys were allowed to do.
Like what?
Well, when I was a kid, you know, boys were allowed not to wash the dishes. My mother would say, don't allow your brother to wash the dishes. You should wash. You're a girl. You wash the dishes. They didn't do any housework. They got to drive cars. Like, my mother disapproved of women driving cars. Things like that. Mm-hmm. And I felt that all my life growing up. I felt that, why am I not allowed? And I thought I would capture that in how Luki felt, growing up in this very conservative society of the tribe.
Mm-hmm. But already you can, and you're describing this, even though the mountain villages did not get colonized, you have the influences of culture already. She makes references to the music, to the rules that they imply. So what happens to this ordinary world, even before she leaves? Because as we're going to see, of course, she's leaving to the World Fair. But yeah, what happens there on this level already?
Yes, so they have, for the first time, this tribe has been infiltrated by an outside force. The Americans invaded the Philippines in 1899, and lots of people don't know that. And they came to the Philippines to Christianize the Catholics, because we were Catholics for 300 years before that, because we were colonized by Spain. But they managed, unlike other colonizers, they managed to get into the mountains, and they won the trust of the Igorots. And the rules were changing, because before the Americans came, there was kind of like people dressed quite scantily, because that was the way of life. There was no kind of malice about the lack of clothing. And the Americans came with their puritanical ways, and the first thing they did was they mandated that women have to wear more clothes, and they set up missions and churches. They tried to change the religion. But one of the things the Americans did right in colonizing us was they said, you can practice your practices, just switch to our religion. And now when you go to the Philippines, this part of the Philippines has the most Episcopalian believers, unlike other parts of the Philippines, which are Catholic. And so, yeah, so they'd already been called, the Americans had arrived, and they were winning hearts and minds as when they arrived. It's very, very ironic.
And it's always astonishing to see how the female body is, with all kind of conservative approaches, is being instrumentalized. I mean, they have to put on the clothes. The men don't. It has the female body, and what females can be doing is being restricted. We're talking about the ordinary world because you made that suggestion in your speech.
It's a wonderful narrative concept. And I feel like I became a better writer when I understood how important the ordinary world was.
I feel like I became a better reader. So let's talk about the ordinary world of the world that Luki is going to get to know. That is the US. Compared to what we learned about the villages in the Philippine mountains now, what are the values of this St. Louis 1904 society? What is the hierarchies? What were the world fairs supposed to be?
So 1904 in St. Louis was a really interesting time because they were just coming out of the industrial era. A lot of people were getting very, very rich out of industry, so there was wealth. And the United States had begun its colonial adventure. Before 1899, the United States felt like an inferior to Europe, because Europe was colonizing everybody in sight. And the Americans were like, if we were really going to become powerful, we've got to colonize somebody. And in 1899, when they invaded the Philippines, they didn't just invade the Philippines, they invaded Puerto Rico, Guam, and Cuba. And to this day, Guam and Puerto Rico are still unincorporated territories of the United States. We became an unincorporated territory. So for that time, we were actually American citizens in 1904. But in 1904 as well, the interesting thing about St. Louis, the city where the World Fair was held, was it was a German city. So many German immigrants came to St. Louis. And one of the funny stories that I discovered was that it's apocryphal, so it might not be true, but it's an interesting story that people tell. Because there were Germans, they were eating Frankfurters. And at the World Fair, because it's a huge, like hundreds of acres where people had to walk around, somebody wanted to eat Frankfurters while walking around. So they invented the hot dog bun. So people invented the hot dog at the World Fair. And when I first heard of that, I love hot dogs. I thought I would write a novel called The Invention of the Hot Dog. And it would be a funny story about a little boy from the Philippines who comes to the World Fair and discovers the invention of the hot dog. But as I researched the story, I discovered that some terrible things happened at the World Fair. And the reason that it was called a hot dog was because they made the Filipinos eat dogs in front of a paying audience And perhaps the reason the hot dog is called the hot dog was because it came from that fair where dogs were being eaten. And there's a reason why they were making the Filipinos eat dogs. In that time, every fun fair, every freak show, every carnival would have an act called the Wild Man of Borneo. It would be a man dressed in a G-string who's very hairy, and the audience would throw raw meat at this wild man, and he would eat the raw meat. And that was the Wild Man of Borneo. And when the Filipinos came, they looked at them and said, hey, these people are wild. They should be eating something like raw meat. And then somebody said, why don't we feed them dogs? And the weird thing was, if you read the anthropological reports about these people, they didn't eat dog. But at the World Fair, every day, twice a day, they had to eat it in front of a paying audience.
That's when you decided that the invention of hot dog is probably not a good title.
Not a good idea, no, not a good idea.
Let's delve into this World Fair concept a little bit more. What was exactly the interest? Because, I mean, we know now they were not invited on an equal kind of level, but what was the interest? Why did they made a lot of effort to invite these people, or force or blackmail them to St. Louis?
Well, the Americans at the time were, have you ever heard the term keeping up with the Joneses?
Yeah.
Yeah, so they're trying to keep up with the Joneses. The Joneses was Europe. And Europe had invented the idea of the World Fair. And at that time, it was a real thing. Spain had a World Fair. England had a World Fair. Belgium had a World Fair. Everyone had a World Fair. It was partly because the Western world was discovering that the world was bigger than they thought, and they were beginning to discover other peoples in the world, other cultures. And so the idea of the World Fair was, one, to exhibit all of their progress. You know, they would exhibit the latest mechanics, the latest technology. Like at the World Fair, they demonstrated at the St. Louis World Fair. They demonstrated the first wall socket, electric wall socket. It hadn't been invented before. They demonstrated light. They didn't have light. Most people lived in homes that were lit by kerosene lamps and candles. And at the World Fair, it was all lit up at night. Can you imagine being able to see that for the first time? So it's like a World Fair is something where you display technology, but you also display people. I think it was the French who first started to display people, because the French had all these colonies in Africa. And they brought in a lot of Africans, and they set up little villages, and people would come and they'd look at the Africans. You know, people couldn't travel in those days. If you wanted to travel, it was very expensive. You traveled by ship, it was dangerous. So bringing the world to the fair was the idea of the World Fair.
So let's jump to St. Louis in 1904, and where Luki is meeting somebody for the first time.
Okay, I'm going to read a chapter where Luki has just arrived at the World Fair, and it began to snow. It's snowing for the first time. She's never seen snow before. At first she thinks it's ashes, because that's the white stuff. She's seen that before, but not snow. And she manages to slip out of the Philippine village, and she climbs up a tree. So this is her climbing up a tree, and in the tree, she meets somebody. I ran out the gate, past the little huts where people would soon be buying tickets to see us, and into the open space between the pretend walled city and the pretend Manila building. For a moment, I stood still, watching the snow swiftly coating everything in a smooth layer of white. Where do you think you're going, Luki? Shouldn't you have stayed and played the peacemaker between those two? Quino, two boys are fighting in the village. I shook my head. Quino had been drawn to the Americans since they'd arrived in Bontoc. Why couldn't Samka just let him be? But that wasn't Samka's way, was it, Mother? I mean, he couldn't let me be when I walked away from him. Since Dylan had fallen ill, I had allowed Samka to talk to me just a little bit. Perhaps I shouldn't have, Mother. We could well end up in a never-ending quarrel, like him and Quino. The reservation was transformed. Cheerful white caps, topped the church tower, a statue, and the tops of the bamboo and banana trees. The tiled roofs of the Visayan buildings had vanished under plump white blankets. The dark stone walls of the fortress were dusted with white powder. Suddenly, in the distance, a roar of laughter. Then applause. The Visayans were singing again. I glanced back at the open gate. If anybody had noticed me missing, there should be people chasing after me already. I wondered if I should go back. But at that moment, a mischievous spirit took hold of me, Mother. I found the snow flying under my boots as I began to run. I turned my back on the Visayan village and followed a faint line in the snow towards the lake. A bridge, caked with snow, crossing to the other side, where we had walked in the forest of neatly spaced trees on that first day. My feet had me over the bridge before my mind had even begun to debate whether to cross or not. My heart was beating fast. It couldn't be that far to the giant wheel, I thought. I could run there and back just to tell Tilin and Sidong that I had done it. But then I heard a shuffling noise. Through the trees, a man was making his way carefully down the path. He wore a bright blue suit with gold buttons, a high red collar, and a matching cap. A Jefferson guard. Mother, the guardsman would be at the end of his adventure. He would march me straight back to the Igorot village. Just then, I floundered. The snow was deeper than I had thought. The icy stuff was seeping into my rubber boots. Oh, Mother, it burned my bare skin. I pulled the boots off. But now what was I going to do? I couldn't walk on the snow in my bare feet. I grabbed a low-hanging branch. Its tree trembled as I climbed up and up and up, dislodging great clumps of snow. I climbed almost to the top where the branches were mere twigs before I squatted down in a bow's elbow, leaning against the young tree's slender trunk and pulling my knees up to my chest so that I could wrap my coat around my cold feet. The guardsman kept walking. He disappeared. I lifted the coat and peeked at my feet. My toes looked red. All this time, the snow had not stopped falling, and the fresh layer had already erased my footsteps. Down below, my boots had vanished too. And then I saw her, a woman, riding a tall white horse. I'd never seen anyone ride a horse like that before. She was not sitting astride. She had both her legs down one side, her long black skirt smoothed over her knees. She rode right up to the tree and looked up at me. "Hey, you," she said. A cloud must have moved overhead because suddenly her face was lit up in a ray of sunshine. She had large blue eyes and a sprinkling of light orange freckles across a face as pale as carabao milk. Tufts of hair the color of dried grass escaped from her tall black hat. "What are you doing up in that tree?" I couldn't think what to do, so I hid behind the tree's trunk. She tilted her head to one side. "If you can see me, I can see you," Mr. William had taught us to say. "How do you do?" But my lips didn't seem to remember the shape of the words. Before I knew it, the woman was speaking again. "I saw you climb it." She grinned. She had great white teeth that stretched her mouth across her face. "You were up there quicker than a squirrel." She moved her horse to right under the tree. Were Americans like the ancients? Did they disapprove of women climbing trees? "You want me go down?" I said at last. "She can speak," the woman laughed. It was a hearty noise like the laughter came from deep inside her belly. "No, don't go down. I'll come up to you." To my amazement, she suddenly sprang to her feet, right there, on her saddle. The horse didn't seem at all surprised, as if this was something she did all the time. I could see now that she was wearing a short black jacket over a dress that tapered to the tiniest waist I had ever seen, flaring out again into a thick billow of skirts. "Hold still, Skyrocket," she muttered to the horse as she grabbed a branch and began to climb. I was so shocked. I just sat there staring, Mother. The tall hat on her head didn't budge as she pulled herself up, stopping at a branch just below me. She swung a leg over, grinning up at me. "You're an Igorot, aren't you?" I can tell by your tattoos. The paper said Igorots lived in trees, and here you are. And boy, I'm glad you can speak English. How do you do? She reached up and grabbed my hand suddenly, squeezing it hard. She was wearing a glove made of deer skin. Lucky I was clinging to another branch with my other hand, or she would have pulled me down. How do you do? I finally managed to say. I am fine, she grinned. Say, the view is great from here. I can see all the way across the lake. Is that why you're up here? To look at the view? I was still trying to decide how to answer her question when she suddenly said, I am so rude. I completely forgot to introduce myself. My name's Sadie Lockett. What's your name? I looked at her. The way she moved, the way she talked, she was unlike any American I'd ever seen. My name, Luki. I was surprised at how easily the words came to my lips. Luki. Sounds like looky. As in, now looky here. It's an Igorot in a tree, Sadie said. Even with that coat on, I could tell you were an Igorot. I've read everything I can find about Igorots in the papers. Boy, oh boy, I can't believe I've actually met one. I mean, that's why I decided to take Skyrocket for a little ride around the lake. I was hoping to catch a glimpse, you know? She smiled up at me. Everyone in the United States of America wants to hurry over to St. Louis to meet all you scary Igorots. But you're not scary at all, are you? That's why I wanted to see you for myself. You never know if what the papers are saying is true. She laughed again. This time, I laughed with her. Mother, even though I could barely keep up with what she was saying, before I knew it, she was talking again. Oh, and I just remembered something else. The papers say you Igorots eat dog for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. Dog? How can you pet the creature one moment and then roast it over a fire the next? Is that true? Dog for breakfast, lunch, and dinner? What was she talking about? Pet him one moment and roast him over a fire? Is that what Americans thought we did? I must have looked dismayed because Sadie Lockett was now regarding me with serious eyes. My golly, so the papers were lying. I'm very sorry I brought it up. I don't know beans about these things. And I'm very sorry that newspapers in the United States of America are such a bunch of slimy, no-good scoundrels. She nodded her head so vigorously the tree shook. I suddenly realized how twiggy the branch she was sitting on looked. I tried to warn her. You, but she was talking again. Is it true Igorots don't drink milk? Maybe that's why you're so darn little. That's how you skittered up this tree with no trouble at all. This tree don't mind little old you, but I'm sure it ain't too happy about an American girl like me grown on milk. Now the tree was groaning as if it was in pain. I sputtered. Spit it out, girl. What do you want to say? Sadie said. You too heavy. Too late. There was an almighty crack, and the branch Sadie Lockett was sitting on crumbled beneath her.
Thank you very much. This is the last part of the conversation, and I just want to tell you already that you can make up questions in your minds because you will have the chance to ask Candy your questions about the novel. But I have some too. Sadie Lockett is not going to die. Luki is going to save her. And I mean, literally, we've seen Luki crossing the threshold here. Where does she want to go? What does she want? Who does she want to be when leaving the village again?
Well, one of the interesting things when you're writing a story, one of the things you have to make sure is that the other characters show your hero ways of being. So Sadie Lockett is an example of what Luki could be. Luki has only known living in the Philippines, living in a village. She'd never been outside her world. And suddenly she meets this other character, and she she talks a lot, like she has this freedom to express herself. She can sit on a horse and she can stand on a horse. And Sadie Lockett is based on an American character. I don't know if you've watched the movie Annie, Get Your Gun. In the 1900s, there were a lot of American women who became trick riders and like gunslingers. And it's a very, very interesting history, all of these performers who turned up in American history. And it was because they lived in a very repressive society. So women were very repressed in the 1900s. And one way that they could do things that they weren't allowed to do at home was they joined the Wild West show. And so they would join the Wild West show and they could ride horses, they could do tricks, and Sadie Lockett was one of them. And in fact, in the story, it's revealed that one of the reasons she leaves is because her parents expect her to marry just like Luki. And it's a way that Luki had not considered, that maybe there were other ways of being, other ways of finding herself, was to do something that was completely different from what was expected of her. And this is really important in a story that you always see. You'll notice it now when you watch movies and read books, that the other characters are performing a function, and that function is to demonstrate to the hero that there are other ways to be.
By this demonstration, what is Luki finding out about herself? I mean, we don't want to give too much away, but maybe you can hint where her way is going to lead her way to herself, basically.
When you meet Luki, she has this burning desire, and her burning desire really is to not be pinned down by the expectations of others. I'm sure, because you are young people, you are weighed down by the expectations of all the grown-ups. And I remember this, being a young person, and my parents wanted to tell me, everything that I did was what my parents told me to do. I felt like I didn't have any agency. I couldn't choose to do the things that I wanted to do. And that's very, very typical of any young person. And as you grow older, your parents will let go, hopefully. They will let go, and they will let you make your own choices. But in some societies, women do not have those choices. And in fact, in the 1900s, most women into adulthood were expected to do the things that men expected them to do. And so for Luki, this was a real mind-blowing revelation that she could be somebody who chose her own destiny.
And Sadie Lockett, what does she want from Luki? Because she's showing a really keen interest, and I mean, it's not too much to give away that she's incorporating Luki into her own show, but what does she find? Because she's maybe has a function for her, but in the way you're mirroring those two women.
Yeah, so I think Sadie's role is not just to show Luki what she can be, but also to show certain relationships that we have today in society, where people of color feel that they are objects of curiosity and objects of fascination. And it's the same with Sadie. Sadie was fascinated by the story of the Igorots and how exotic Luki was, how exotic the Igorots were. And she didn't know, in the story, it's going to be, she befriends Luki, so they do become friends. And there are things that could make them best friends, but they have this power inequality. The power inequality is that Luki doesn't have any choices. She is somebody who's trapped in this situation where she is in a Philippine village and everyone is telling her what to do. And Sadie is a...
Plus the Americans are telling the village what to do and how to function.
Yes. And Sadie, even though she's restricted by society, she has all the choices. She has all the privilege. We hear people saying today, check your privilege. She had all the privilege. And she didn't know how to be friends with somebody who didn't have the power that she had. And that is the story between those two. And I feel, because I am a person of color, that this is a constant negotiation that I have with my really good friends who are not people of color. And it takes a very, very big leap for someone who is not a person of color to understand and to stand in the shoes of somebody who lives in society, in the place in society that we live in.
Now let's zoom out again, and would you let us know how history went further with the Igorot? What happened to them, and who has been telling their stories from the press that kind of painted them as eating dogs to what happened after?
Well, the story of the Igorot is a very, very sad story because they experienced prejudice from the Americans, and then they experienced prejudice from the Filipinos, because Filipinos who grew up, the Filipinos from the lowlands who had grown up with a kind of westernized, so under the Spanish, they were like Spanish speaking, they had bullfights, they had universities, they had all kinds of trappings of Spanish color, they wrote novels. They were embarrassed by indigenous people. They felt indigenous people made them look bad in the world because everyone wanted to be considered to be civilized. They did not see the richness of indigenous culture. And unfortunately, that happens to this day. But the people who were actually in the story, because a lot of this is based on real people, they were headed for a really hard time because during the American occupation of the Philippines, a lot of the culture was destroyed, erased. They were banned from practicing their culture. And then at the very end of the American 50 years under America, we had World War II, and the Japanese came in. And I found a list of the names of the people who actually went to the World's Fair, and the years that they were born and the years that they died. And a lot of the Filipinos who went to the World's Fair, a lot of the Igorots who went to the World's Fair, died in World War II because of the terrible bombing. And so it was not a happy ending for them. And writing the ending of the book was really difficult because I knew that, you know, when they go back to the Philippines, it was not going to be great. I spent months thinking about my ending at the very beginning of writing the story. And in fact, I suddenly found my ending and I wrote it. I wrote the ending first. And everything I wrote from then on headed towards that ending. And I'm not going to read you the ending because it's going to be a spoiler, but I feel like it's the best writing that I did in the book.
And you told us in your speech that when you launched Wild Song in London, where the 20 Igorot children were, because they are here, and how you felt when they did attend. Would you, because I want to close with the power of writing and with the power of sharing what you wrote, tell us more about this full circle moment that would not have been possible without this story, not without you, the real life hero, writing it.
I wouldn't call myself a hero.
No, I do.
But, you know, one of the things that happened to the Igorots was because of the Americans made them perform their culture, something that they had never done before. Dancing and singing were part of their religion. But over the years, it became a thing to make the Igorots dance and sing as if it's a show. And I had lots of conversations with my Igorot friends about it. And when they came to my book launch to dance and sing, I was like, am I doing to them what the World Fair did to the Igorots, you know? But they surprised me because they came, they were dressed in their costume. And then a little girl stood up and she began to tell the story of who they were. She said, I was born in England, but my grandmother came to the United Kingdom as a nurse. And that is why we are British today, but we are also Igorot. And each child stood up and testified as to who they were, and they knew who they were. And then they sang and danced. And I thought, that's really amazing, because these are children with British accents who speak English, you know, and who are in their normal day, they are British. But they were remembering. They were remembering where they had come from. Even some of them had never been. They remembered who they were. And that is something that's really important for all of us. We should remember who we really are. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Candy, for these closing words already. And now I would like to open for questions from the audience. There's one question back there. Can you shout really, or do we have some microphones traveling? But you can shout. Which character was the most challenging for her to write? Yes.
Most challenging character to write. I don't like writing action, and I think one of the hardest characters to write were the American characters. There's a character called Truman Hunt, who was the man who recruited the Igorots and brought them over. And at the beginning, he's a good man. He's kind of somebody that even the Igorots really liked. And then he has this transformation through the book, and he becomes a greedy entrepreneur. And it was really hard to write because I don't know how that feels to break bad. He broke bad, and that's very, very hard to write.
And isn't that an opportunity as well to delve into these uncharted territories in yourself?
Oh yeah, the harder it is to write, the more fascinating it is. Yeah, I mean, Little Luki was kind of easy to write because Little Luki is just me, so that's easy. But that was really hard, trying to imagine how an American person would feel.
Other questions, please. Just stand up.
There's somebody there?
Yes, yes, please. How long did it take her to write the book, and how did she manage the time while writing? Yeah.
Okay, I'll answer the second question first. How did I manage the time? Badly, very, very badly. And when did I start writing the book? Was 2005. It was a long time ago, and when I first saw that photo, I started writing the book, and I felt really bad about starting then because I hadn't been published yet. It was the first book I tried to write, and I realized I had to learn so much. I didn't know about writing, and then I realized that story was really hard. I didn't understand the history, and I didn't understand racism. It didn't make any sense to me. Racism doesn't make any sense and I had to understand, where is that coming from? What does it mean? How can you feel that way about somebody just because of the color of their skin? It didn't make sense to me, and it took me many, many years to understand and to feel that I could write it. And then the final bit of the book was written during lockdown. So I was really
Which helped,
struggling.
I guess.
No, I was really struggling. I would sit and not be able to write. And in the end, my publisher found a woman named Linda, I can't remember Linda's name, oh no, Linda, and I submitted everything I wrote every day. When I finished the day, I would send her what I wrote, whether it was bad or not, and she would read it. And knowing that someone was reading it helped me keep writing every day.
Is that still the same? You need to know that there are readers?
No, it was just for this book.
For this, okay.
I don't know why.
Bitteschön.
My favorite character. My favorite character is it's Luki. But my second favorite character in the book was a man called Lieutenant Loving. He's a black man. And Lieutenant Loving was the conductor of the Philippine Constabulary Band, and he's a real person. And it's really what's astonishing is when the Americans came to the Philippines, it was a time of Jim Crow. I don't know what Jim Crow is in America. It was a time of segregation in America, so black people had no rights. Black people didn't go to the World's Fair. But when the black people came to the Philippines, there was no segregation. They could mix with white people, everyone was mixed. And that's why Lieutenant Loving came to the Philippines. And he became the conductor of the World Fair, of the Constabulary Band, which became like one of the most popular acts in the World Fair, to the point that they played during one of the presidential inaugurations. But none of the newspapers ever mentioned Lieutenant Loving because he was black, even though he was the one who arranged and conducted the music. I was able to honor him in the book.
That's
and mention
I mean,
him.
yeah, important work. 360. Habt ihr noch Fragen? Are there more questions? Yes, here. Schrei mal ein bisschen lauter, bitte. Did your life change after publishing this book?
I think it did change. I understood so many things about my culture that I didn't understand before. And strange things, like when I was growing up, my mother was very racist about herself. That's the only word for it, because she was like, don't go in the sun, you're gonna get brown. And I'm like, Mom, I'm already brown. And then she would like squeeze my nose, and she would say, squeeze your nose every day so that it's not too wide. And I was like, Mom, you're so weird. And then I discovered that at the World Fair, because the scientists were trying to establish this science called eugenics, every single Filipino at the World Fair had their noses measured by these scientists, because they believed that the wider your nose, the more inferior you are. And I thought, oh my God, so all of these Filipinos who were being colonized by Americans had their noses measured. And that's why my mother, she was born in the 1930s. My mother was obsessed with not having a wide nose. And I suddenly understood what happened. And I also began to understand the role of my family in the Philippines. We live in the southern, my father grew up in the southern Philippines. But this is a part of the Philippines filled with indigenous people. And the Americans couldn't conquer it. So they used the playbook of what they did in the Wild West in America, where they sent Americans to settle the land. And that's how a lot of Indians were dispersed and killed, and terrible genocide happened. That's what they did in the Philippines too. They sent Filipinos from other parts to this part of the world. And that's why my family was there. They were the settlers, they were the cowboys, and they caused the indigenous people in that island to be pushed aside and die and lose their cultures. We had a role in that. And all of these things kind of really opened my mind to how there's not one story, but many, many stories. And some of them are not things you can be proud of, but they're so important to know.
Then I would like to thank you, Candy Gourlay, for being here. Thank you for presenting Wildong. Thank you for being here. Of course, Candy will be signing books at the Kassenhalle, so you can get your copy in German and in English. She's signing at the Kassenhalle, and of course, events like this would not be possible without people funding it, like the Hauptstadt Kulturfonds. Thank you very much. The Hauptsponsor for the youth program, Thalia. Thank you very much. Have a nice day. Thank you. Your applause,
Thanks, Vivian.
Candy.
Thank you.